Hello and welcome back to the Gut Health Roundtable. I'm your host, Jason Prawl, and in this episode, I sit down with Dr. Keesha Ewers. She's a board certified functional and advanced Ayurvedic medical practitioner, as well as a doctor of sexology, advanced registered nurse practitioner, psychotherapist, energy worker, and the founder and medical director of the Academy for Integrative Medicine Health Coaching Certification Program. Dr. Keesha has been in the medical field for over 30 years. After being diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, an incurable disease according to Western medicine, she discovered how to reverse autoimmunity using her Freedom Framework method, which she has now used with thousands of her own patients and teaches to her health coach students in her online certification program. In this episode, you'll learn how emotional trauma affects gut health, the relationship between microbiome diversity and emotional resilience, and taking a lifestyle approach to improve the gut ecosystem. Stay tuned. Keesha, welcome to the Gut Health Roundtable.
Oh, thanks, Jason. This is such a great platform for sharing important information. Thanks for doing it.
Absolutely. And you and I always go off on these amazing tangents and talk about some cool stuff. We're going to be a little more grounded in what we talk about today, but I have a feeling we're probably going to get into some cool stuff too. Given that we are going to be talking about the gut, there are so many aspects to the way we think, the way we feel, the way we live that influence the gut. So I'm curious what you got in store for us today.
All right. Well, I'm actually going to share my screen and I'll show you.
Perfect.
So I actually put together some slides on mood and microbes and this intersection of genetic expression, past trauma, and then how that affects your hormone balance and everything else in your body, your immune system through your microbial ecosystem.
Beautiful. That's a lot of stuff. And
Yes.
not a lot of people take this approach. But from my own experience and through learning from people like you and others, this is a huge aspect.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about this because there's, it used to be that we relied on some of the ancient forms of medicine like Ayurvedic medicine or Chinese medicine to really bring a whole body approach to things. But now there's a bunch of science in our contemporary time that I'm going to share just a tiny little bit. So I'll talk about this connection between mood and microbes, how past trauma impacts your microbiome, how trauma and microbes actually impact how your genetics express themselves. We now know this term epigenetics, and that you're not a prisoner of your genes, so to speak, that we can alter how they express themselves. And then I'm going to talk about the science and go through the HURT study, which stands for Healing Unresolved Trauma Study, and the HURT model. And then I'm going to just kind of go through a quick ABC to 1, 2, 3 of how to balance your ecosystem rather than just end with this is a problem. We'll talk a little bit about what to do with it. So there was a study that was done in Europe that looked at the impact of childhood trauma and microbial balance, and they took 115 children. They were Belgian children, and they were looking at the extreme psychosocial deprivation that happens in an institutional environment before an adoption happens. And they looked at these orphanages and then compared them with 229 kids that were raised by biological caregivers. And they did brain scans on these kids. They looked at emotional regulatory skills, and then they also looked at the microbiome. And so it was the first kind of this kind of study that has actually been done where it pulled all that together. And what they found is that in the institutionalized children, that there was less microbial diversity, that the prefrontal cortex, this is the part of the brain that actually isn't really online until you're 26 years of age anyway, but it is the one that's responsible for emotional processing, that there was lower volume in this neocortex. And that when they compared that to ones that were raised in biological families, that it was the opposite. There was good gut microbiome diversity and better prefrontal cortex brain development, which meant better emotional regulation when they tested it. And then the other findings from research, as I did a review of literature, moving outside of that study, we know that there's a history of trauma reported in half of adults with in, any kind of inflammatory bowel disease, including irritable bowel syndrome, and that any kind of gastrointestinal symptoms now in young children are being considered a red flag for future emotional health problems based on some of these studies that are now coming out. Another one that was really interesting that I looked at was post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and there was a question about, which I'll get to, is this a result of PTSD, in other words, a big trauma, or is this lack of diversity in the microbiome a reason why two people can have the same experience, but only one comes out with PTSD? So there were 3 particular strains of bacteria that I've put up here that had a decrease. And what these particular bacteria do actually have some important functions in the body. So not having them actually increase rates of inflammation. And in the next slide, I'll show you what actually this comes down to. So PTSD, we know that people are at higher risk for developing actual diagnosable post-traumatic stress disorder based on living conditions, childhood experiences, genetics, gut bacteria. And it's the gut bacteria piece that influences the brain and the brain function by producing these neurotransmitters and hormones and immune regulating molecules and bacterial toxins. I'm going to show a slide about how that works in a negative feedback loop later. So, in that same study where we were looking at over 1,000 Belgians and 1,000 Dutch people, again, a lower biodiversity, in particular, a couple of strains that were missing from people that reported depression in the survey. So what we know is that Coprococcus and Dialister actually influence, again, butyrate production, which butyrate helps in reducing inflammation, and also is responsible for the proper synapsing of dopamine, which of course dopamine's in charge of mood, memory, motivation, libido, and addiction if there's a problem. So this was a big thing because what they were seeing is that, again, is it depressed people that have a lower number of these GI microbes, or is it the lower number of GI microbes that causes the depression? That hasn't been answered in the research. But one of the things that is being answered is that one of the reasons for the lack of diversity is a history of childhood trauma. So one of the studies showed that people with the very same digestive issues but no early life trauma, okay, and then people with neither digestive issues nor trauma were studied, okay? And what they came up with is the changes in the gut microbiome, and this is a quote from the study, made in response to trauma could potentially last a lifetime based on the stress gut-brain connection. So this came out in Microbiome in 2017, showing that immune system and mood were altered by the gut microbiome. And what they were making a correlation for is if there's a history of trauma, it can't be fixed, which is wrong. Because what that means is it can't be fixed if there's no intervention, right? If you don't go back and heal your trauma, because further studies have shown that you can actually go and heal your trauma, heal your gut, and then things can flourish. The biodiversity can increase. So it was kind of sad when you see this reductionist way of doing science, that the outcome is, it's the same thing like when I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, my doctor gave me a couple prescriptions and said, when you get worse, come back and we'll change your medication from methotrexate to a biologic, not if you get worse. And so it's this sort of dogmatic, here's what the science shows and therefore there's no way out of it, that I wanted to make sure to highlight that no, research is indicating that once you have this information, it gives you a pointer to where you can go to actually heal it.
Well, and one thing too, Keesha, is that in these studies, we're always looking for a direct causation, right? And this is hard in science to find this sort of straight line connection. And you hear it a lot of times that people, when they try to deny a study or research, they say, oh, it's just a correlation, or oh, it's just association. And to some degree, that's a good argument, right? Yeah, it's just an association. We don't know the causal mechanisms per se. However, what I have come to recognize with a lot of this stuff is that it's usually a dual causality. It's a back and forth. It's a bidirectional influence, and one thing can influence the other and vice versa. So just looking at this, it's like, it seems to me that if we influence the microbiota and the microbiome as a whole, we can influence mood. And if we influence the trauma, then we can influence the gut microbiota. And we don't have to do one or the other necessarily. We just recognize that there is this connection somehow, and perhaps we can influence one or the other, or both.
Right. Well, I came back to the slide when you said that, because it's more than bidirectional, it's actually multifaceted, right?
Yes, yes.
So, living conditions, childhood experiences, genetics, gut bacteria, and then these are only the things that have been studied. And if you were to go into Buddhist psychology, which I have been diving into lately, the influence of, you could say, karma, or what your consciousness that you brought into this life that you wanted to achieve in this life is going to also set you up in this certain form that you take, right? And so it's moving outside of this reductionist way of thinking to, oh, it's so much larger.
Right.
And it's changing the view, right? Yeah, changing the view from, oh, if we take this one kind of probiotic that's marketed to help your mood or increase these 3 organisms, then you're going to have a better mood. Actually, science is indicating that's not true. And to your point, what's so interesting is, human longevity, I think, is familiar to you. And and so in the 1970s, a group of researchers went to Okinawa, right, and said, why are these people living to be over 100 years old and so healthy? And they wanted to study them. So this team goes and they look, they examine the life of, these 100-year-old people, and come back with the active ingredient, which is how we tend to reduce things down to, right? And so what they said is, they're living intergenerationally, they're walking everywhere, they're spending time just being with each other, not doing. They're eating only what can fit in a rice bowl with chopsticks so slowly, that it wasn't like, none of that was mentioned, because I've lived in Japan for many years. I know exactly what they observed. Yeah. Instead, they came home and they said, oh, they eat a lot of soy. And so dumped a whole bunch of soy into our food supply. It's crazy how we think about this. We are always looking for that active ingredient.
The one thing, yeah.
The one thing, right? The smoking gun. And so, my purpose of putting these things together is to give everyone a picture of really what the reality is, which is it's so varied and so multi-directional and so multifaceted. And that indeed, these early beliefs that we create out of the meanings that we make about our childhood experiences set it up, So yes, we have the microbiota from birth, from our mother, whether we're C-section or vaginal birth, and then how we were fed, whether it was bottle or breast, and what she ate and what she was doing and how many antibiotics you had when you were a child, definitely starts it out. But also the meanings that we create with how we perceive our world are started because of our childhood experiences. So there was a very large study done between 1995 and 1997 by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, called the ACEs study. And how this came to be is that Kaiser had a weight loss clinic, and it was very successful. People were losing weight, but a lot of people were dropping out before they got to goal. And the clinic director said, was curious and started interviewing them, and found that many to most had actually been sexually abused in childhood. And so luckily he was curious and wanted to find out, like, what's the correlation, and partnered with the CDC, and they did this it's over 17,000 people strong study, and looked at Kaiser enrollees and asked about 10 different kinds of what you could think of as what I call capital T trauma, right? They're the things you normally think of as trauma. Physical and emotional and sexual abuse, any kind of abandonment or neglect, where a parent or caregiver is addicted to a substance, or incarcerated, or mentally ill, or a victim of domestic violence, or divorced, or dead. So all of these big losses actually add up to what is your individual ACE score. And so in my book, Solving the Autoimmune Puzzle, I put the ACEs quiz, and then I have you do your score. And at the end I say, so now you have this number, and, so and, not but, now you have a pathway to alter the direction that this sets you up for. Because statistically, what the study outcomes were is that the higher your ACEs score, the higher your risk for all of the diseases that we have in our society today, including mood disorders. So, all autoimmunity, cancer, depression, and then also an altered gut microbiome and altered genetic expression, just from experiences that you have in your childhood and what the meanings were that you made from those about yourself and your role in the world. So if you came out looking for people to hurt you, then there's a hypervigilance about that with cortisol that's being released very easily. And of course, that creates a different microbiome than if you didn't have that constantly happening. So it's very fascinating how much of this can be altered.
Well, and we go back one, Keesha, because at the top you've got behaviors, and I think this is one of the common sort of initial threads that we might think of. It's like, well, okay, if I had all these traumas, yeah, that's more likely to lead to smoking and alcohol, heavy alcohol use and drug use and all these behavioral modifications. But correct me if I'm wrong, but they even isolated that out and found that even despite behavior, we still see drastic rises in all the diseases, right?
Well, what I found is when I looked further into the literature, when I was doing my first studies about this, I found that outside of the ACEs studies, that there have been studies that show that when there's trauma, there's an increased risk of self-neglect. So if you experienced perceived neglect in childhood, then you're going to grow into an adult that neglects yourself. So that could be actually being a workaholic, not just missed work, right? Too busy to exercise, too busy to sit and meditate, too busy to take a detox bath at night, too busy, right, to do
play,
yoga.
to relax, yeah,
to relax, to just be. That there's a connection between worth and achievement, which our society actually really rewards, right? We're a very productivity, achievement-oriented society. And so then I call that the trauma marinade that we're all steeping in, that we're actually born into that traumatic soup of you're only worth what you produce. And so this just feeds it, right?
Yeah, and just to kind of give people a framework too, from my own experience on the ACEs, I went and took that survey. And again, it's only 10. It's only the 10 of the sort of common, but I went through and I think I had 3 or 4. And, it included parents that were divorced. I think there was I can't remember what else, but it was very standard stuff. And a parent that was incarcerated. And it was like, I would even say I had a pretty normal, non-crazy childhood. And I was like, oh man, like I have 3. And then I looked at the statistics and it's like all these increased risks, right? And which is not the death sentence, as you've said, and I'm sure you'll get more into that. But it was just interesting to note that I would not classify my childhood as extremely traumatic. And yet I was on that list.
And I think that's a really important thing to point to, Jason, because people will say to me like, oh, I didn't have any trauma in my childhood, and that's where I started differentiating and saying, well, actually everybody has trauma in childhood, but differentiating between capital T trauma, which is the ACEs, the 10 forms of neglect and abandonment kinds of things that can happen, overt abuse, and then the things that we don't look at, and I'll talk about those here in a minute, that are part of this cultural trauma that we all live inside of. So from the ACEs study, what they found is the higher your score, the higher your risk. And once you get over 6 ACEs, then the statistics show that your risk of living 20 fewer years than someone with no ACEs is very real. And again, totally reversible. So this comes back to what I was talking about, that everybody has some kind of trauma and, you know, PTSD and an ACE score that you can actually look at. That's the capital T, or the Healing Unresolved Trauma study is the study that I did. So I talk about it as HURT. And then there was a researcher by the name of Mole who their team was looking at fMRI scans of brains and finding that people with PTSD and that capital T trauma actually had shrinkage of the prefrontal cortex in adulthood. Remember that the prefrontal cortex, the executive function of the brain, is the part that decides how you're going to spend your money, who you're going to hang out with and marry, what you're going to do for a living, whether or not you're going to go to work, what you're going to put on the end of your fork and in your cup and drink and eat. All of this stuff has to do with adult executive decision-making processing. And what they discovered is, yes, there was a shrinkage in that part with PTSD, and then a growth in the right side of the amygdala, which is, you know, increased volume of what I was showing you earlier, kind of like a meerkat in Africa, right? Looking all the time around, you know, for some form of danger. And so the interesting thing that they found that was kind of a byproduct of looking at this is they also gave people in their study a perceived stress index questionnaire. And this is where you write, like, yes, I've been divorced this year, I've moved, I've changed jobs, right? And you get to say, like, how stressed you feel. And what they discovered is people that report themselves as chronically overwhelmed. Now, this is a word that I hear constantly in my practice with my patients. I'm so overwhelmed. I can't do this that you're asking me to do, this pranayama, conscious breathing practice. I just don't have time. I'm so overwhelmed. If you only knew what my schedule looked like, which of course is why they're sitting in front of me in the first place, right? But they discovered that the people that report themselves as being stressed chronically have the exact same brain changes as those that have PTSD and an ACE score. So basically, our culture is creating a brain drain and this constant stress to achieve and produce that's keeping us in a state of overscheduled, overburdened, overwhelmed in our perception of ourselves in the world. And that's causing these brain changes.
And you said something there that's interesting, because you see this a lot when people talk about time. I don't have time.
Yeah.
And then you hear the, you know, the sort of motivational crowd that says, you know, everybody's got 24 hours in a day, right? And it's this, for me, what really clicked at some point was, oh, it's not really the time thing, because we all do have the same amount of time. It's this perception of time. It's my perception that I really don't have time. And it's because my nervous system, my brain, my monkey mind, my mental is just so on all the time. And what we're really saying, I think, is that I don't perceive there to be enough sort of mental, emotional capacity for me to do what you're asking me to do,
right.
To sort of squeeze this thing in, because my mind is going in so many other directions. I cannot hit pause on that. So I just want to sort of shed some light on that, because it really is just this perception thing. And once we understand that the perception is the key to all this, not the actual, you know, on paper time, you know, the clock is not really the factor here.
Right. Well, I'm going to show you the HURT model, and I'll show you why the ACEs study came out with the outcomes they did, and it will point to exactly what you're talking about, but it'll give you a map for understanding it. It's pretty interesting.
Beautiful.
So I don't know if you can hear the rain outside behind me. You and I were talking off air about the rain in Seattle right now, and I was saying it's the heaviest that we've had in ever on record, and mudslides are everywhere, and there's just so much water. And people have been saying to me, oh man, I don't know how you do it. And you know, there's this very interesting, this is a perfect example where I have so much appreciation and gratitude for the rain. I get to stay inside and I get to write during the winter time, and it doesn't call me to go outside and be in the mountains and in my kayak, which when it's sunny, that's where I'm going to be found. And so I get to actually have this seasonal shift of going internal, being contemplative, and really writing and working on that kind of work into the world. And then in the summertime, it's more active and less receptive. And so it gives me this very lovely rhythm to be able to live into. And I have all this appreciation because water is a big problem in the world. And I know that where I live, it's not, you know, like we can collect it and we've got water. And so it's like this way of perceiving, right? Now, if you have, what research shows is there are two things about this. If your microbiome lacks diversity, then you're going to have less emotional and mental resilience to get to that place. So then if it lacks diversity, then you're going to have the people that come into my office that say, I feel like I'm either going to kill myself or someone else if it doesn't start shining outside. You know, it's just like this seasonal affective disorder, right? And so you can see that depression, cognitive shutdown, anxiety, isolation will happen the lower the gut microbiome diversity is. And then what we've seen from research is that if you actually consciously work on that gratitude and appreciation, lo and behold, your cortisol goes down, the neurotransmitters responsible for anxiety that release cortisol stop flowing into the system, stop breaking down the gut wall, and then microbiome diversity goes up. So in this case, this bidirectional quality is really important to highlight because it's not one direction, right? This is that gut-brain axis. And mood is very, very incorporated into this, as well as body weight and cognitive function, and also longevity. So the more difficult your life experiences are in childhood, the higher the risk that you're not going to be able to get to that place of appreciation and gratitude. And you can change that. And so that becomes outside of the match pill to ill paradigm, where it's not taking a pill to change your gut microbiome, because what we found is that doesn't work. That you actually have to do the work of growing the track, laying down the track in your mind for appreciation and gratitude of how you perceive your past experiences, and learning how to go back with a fully developed brain now. Remember, it's not fully developed till you're 26. And then you can go back and you can review. So it's changing your view of those things that happened in your early days and moving from a different perceptual field. And that changes your microbiome. Isn't that cool? And genetic expression.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, honestly, and
Yeah.
It shouldn't really surprise us, right? I mean, in one sense, it's very surprising. It's very interesting. On another level, you know, of course, everything that we think and feel and believe and our presence in the world should, you know, just naturally affect everything about our physical body, right? So it does make sense. And I'm excited actually for the next, you know, decade as science continues to unravel how this actually works, because I think that'll continue and further convince people of this reality.
So there's some interesting, outside of the world of Western science, you know, if we can, again, track some of the ancients that have already been here and made a map for us in the world of meditation. You know, my patients will often tell me I can't meditate because I can't make my mind shut down. It's not supposed to. You know, that's actually a flatlined EEG, and that means you're dead, and that's not the goal of meditation. You know, but one of the things that happens in this meditation map of consciousness is the understanding that you have to have a fully developed sense of self and ego. And so if you have childhood trauma and you haven't developed a really good sense of self and ego, then when you get into a meditation practice that says you need to negate the ego or get rid of the ego or overcome the ego, move beyond the ego, that's actually an impossibility, and it creates fracturing, and people get worse. They get more anxious. They get more insomnia. They can even have psychosis. And so this idea that we have to somehow move outside of, you know, what our ego states is real for us is not that. Meditation is meant for us to observe the workings of how we're perceiving our world. And as soon as we can get to a place where we have this really nice foundational place that we sit on, where we go, okay, I'm whole and complete, and I have a purpose in my life and in the world. From that place, then meditation can take us into another place in consciousness. But before that, really what we want is just a nice, balanced sense of self. And so I think people, run away from the idea of meditation because they've heard some of these other things. And so I just want to kind of bring that back to, you know what, let's stick with the basics, right? We need to be hydrated. We need to eat well. We need to get plenty of sleep. And then in our introspective practice, we need to make sure that we feel like our worth is on the inside and it's not on the outside for other people to regulate for us.
And one of the things with meditation that I find so helpful for some is that, it's just funny how meditation has been applied in the West, because a lot of the teachings involve achieving some state, feeling better, resolving something, and there's a goal and an objective with meditation. And I don't want to deny that reality. I think that can be okay. And also, there's a whole different way to look at meditation, which is that there is no goal, there is no objective. And as soon as we can, this is sort of more of the Dzogchen teachings, but as soon as you can step back from that and relax about it and remove any objective, then you can't do it wrong or right. There's nowhere to go. You're not aiming for anything other than just to sit there and let whatever be come up and just sit there. That's it. There's nothing to it. So I think for me, that's as someone who's conditioned to want to achieve something, to accomplish something, to find the right way to do something, to optimize something, meditation, by just sitting there and relaxing into whatever wants to show up, that's just such an easy way to go about it, because then you remove these obstacles for yourself of, am I doing this right or am I doing it wrong? When am I going to get it? How do I move forward? There is no moving forward. In fact, that's the exact objective, or lack of objective, is to just stay in one place as you are.
Well, and in that place as you are of just being and not having something to achieve, your body gets a chance to speak to you and give you information, because the body itself has its own consciousness. And we tend to be in the space where we're supposed to be brains dragging the body behind and controlling it. We have to have it be the certain weight and it has to look the certain way. And if it's not doing that, then it's letting us down and it's betraying us. And in fact, the body actually has its own consciousness that if we can sit still and become collaborative with it, then these impulses and informational patterns can bubble to the top so that you're able to get them. So we have the vagus nerve, of course, is the darling of our time right now. And, the vagus nerve is the wandering nerve, and it moves from the genitalia all the way up into the brain, and it hits most of the organ systems. And now there are all kinds of little gadgets for stimulating the vagus nerve. But, again, it's bypassing when we're doing that, because you can stimulate your vagus nerve with conscious breathing exercises, where you're dropping awareness into this gorgeous body that you have been blessed with. And then you get a sense of what that neurotransmitter synapsing is doing. You get a sense of what your immune system is doing. You get to understand what the nervous system itself, where it's playing and what needs to happen. And when you can do that, then you can start to understand. I always tell people, in Western societies, we tend to think that we have to be passive bystanders of our nervous system and how it reacts. And I think about that, I have 4 kids. So one of my kids being in a grocery store and running down the aisle and just sweeping all the cans off the aisle and laughing, and me just saying, stop doing that, okay? Where it's just, instead of saying, no, this is not how you behave in a grocery store. Let's use our words right now and what's going on for you, right? And so that we get to interact in that same way with our body in a very compassionately curious, loving way of not letting it just do what it's been doing since childhood. And so you can see from this diagram, if you can really sit still long enough to listen, all of this will burble to the top for you. So this is just more of the same, right? A healthy central nervous system response is actually going to create, I always say it's leaky boundaries of the mind. In other words, I don't say no, I help everybody, or I get my worth from helping other people or rescuing them, or I get my worth from being successful, or I get my worth from knowing enough. All of those things are a lack of good boundaries psychologically with yourself. And so leaky boundaries leads to leaky gut. And I think everyone on this webinar probably has heard the term leaky gut, and I don't have to go into depth because probably all of your guests have been speaking about leaky gut. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, it is. But I think maybe sometimes what is forgotten about or maybe not mentioned enough is that, the gut lining, let's just use that as an example. It is designed to let some things through, right? And
Yep.
so there's two sides to this. We have this hyperpermeability, but then also the other side, which is also due to damage and imbalance, is not letting enough through, and we're not able to metabolize our food and absorb and assimilate the things that are being broken down. So to your point with the boundaries, it's like we can have excessively leaky boundaries emotionally and mentally and in our lifestyle, or we can go the other way and our boundaries are too strong. We're not letting things in, and we're resisting everything that's coming at us, right? So
the excesses of that on the scale are going to be narcissistic personality disorder, right? And codependent empath. And so both of them are going to have unhealthy gut walls.
Well, it's interesting too, because our society today in the West is very hyper aware of the sort of narcissistic personalities and situations. And I think because it is and has been so prevalent and it is so obvious, we've skewed the other way. And we're now viewing, I think a lot of times, this idea of empathy without boundary as this beautiful state of lovingness, right?
No.
So there's a healthy middle, right?
Yeah, it's so funny because I'm writing a book on healing trauma right now, and one of the chapter titles is "I'm a Narcissist and I Am Too." And it's just like everybody in our culture has narcissistic personality tendencies, whether or not you're diagnosable on that extreme end of the spectrum or not, because that's the culture that we're put into, right? And that we're steeped in.
Well, and some of us haven't, and I would include myself in this, as we've gotten into our adulthood, we haven't moved beyond that narcissistic point in our development. Right. 2 years old, when we're starting to say no, and this is mine, and all this stuff, right? We still have some of those, let's say, echoes of our past selves that we haven't healed and worked to become adults yet. Right.
And if you've ever been to a functional medicine practitioner who has said, you really need to stop eating gluten, or alcohol is not good for you, or, I do genetic testing on 100% of my patients. And the reason for that is I want to see how well their liver detoxification pathways match up, what's going on with their mitochondrial DNA wiring, and all these neurotransmitters are in there too. And so I'll say, if you don't want this particular neurotransmitter to kick up your anxiety, which you've been having your whole life, you told me, then it would be a good idea if you didn't have this food. And you can tell your narcissism is kicking up when you hear inside of yourself, but everyone else can have that, why can't I? Or I can't go without that, or it's like, this is the piece that people don't recognize as an ego-based need. It's not actually your body saying, yes, I think I need to have coffee every day. If you think you need coffee every day, your adrenals are probably tired, And so, I can't give up coffee. That's a narcissistic tendency. And so it's really fascinating. People don't recognize that, right? They think about it in a completely different way, but that's a lack of boundaries with yourself.
Right. And there's a spectrum, right? I think that's kind of what you're pointing to here, is that it's not one or the other.
Listen to your body,
right?
Find out what it's asking for. And then with compassionate curiosity, start engaging with it. That actually is empathy plus a lack of narcissism. It's learning how to engage in the unique, beautiful way that your system is asking for.
Right. And when we talk about empathy, I think a lot of times we think about empathy towards others, and rarely or often we forget that it's empathy towards ourselves that sometimes we need most. So just to, yes, exactly. Yeah. And just to tie that last slide up, essentially what you're pointing to here is the traumas and the wounds and the hurts that we have in our childhood primarily, but really as we come into this world, that affects our nervous system, according to the last slide. And the nervous system is, of course, highly intertwined with our whole digestive system and the gut microbial balance and everything going on there, right?
Right. And so what we see is, and I'm going to show you again, like the hurt model will walk you through that whole process. But as you look here, it's showing like emotion linked to actual disease processes in the body. And I'm going to show you that link of how that nervous system bridges those two things and why that's the case. because it isn't just our microbiome, it's our nervous system's response that's actually changing the microbiome. And of course, 80% of our immune system synapse there, and so are our neurotransmitters. And so all this stuff then becomes a negative feedback loop.
And
So
we've got this enteric nervous system too, right? That we think about nervous system in terms of brain, spinal cord, but we have a whole nervous system in our gut that's just massive, right?
I love this slide because this is the enteric nervous system right here.
Perfect. It is, yes.
If anyone has seen, what is it, Inside Out by Pixar? It's such a good movie because it actually really goes through and teases apart these emotions. Have you seen it, Jason?
I haven't, no, but
Oh.
with my new little one coming, I'm sure these Pixar films are going to start to creep in.
Oh,
more
no,
and more.
this is an adult movie.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Totally, yeah. Your little one's not even gonna tell later. No, this is Lewis Black, the comedian who plays the angry guy. It's so good. So one of the things that Ayurvedic medicine knew 10,000 years ago, and of course Ayurveda is the sister science of yoga, the medical arm out of India of yoga practice, is that autoimmune disease is undigested anger. And so when I first heard this, when I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis when I was 30, and I'm 55 this month, so 25 years ago, I just remember being really disconnected from this sentence. What? Because I just had no idea that there was such a thing as digesting an emotion. When we think about our microbiome, what is our microbiome for? So much of it is about breaking down our food so we can absorb it. But what I didn't realize is actually we also have to break down our feelings and our experiences and memories and our emotions, and that we literally have to digest them well if we're going to get what we need from them for the growth of our consciousness. And so when I got in touch with this was when I learned how to meditate. And I learned, I went kind of backwards in my meditation one day, asking the question, why do I have autoimmune disease? That actually means that I'm killing myself. I'm committing suicide in a societally acceptable manner. When's the first time I wanted to die? Because I don't want to die right now. And as I went backwards, I found, discovered this 10-year-old little girl version of myself that was being sexually abused by the vice principal of my elementary school. And I went, oh, I've never been angry about that. I've suppressed it and transformed it into being nice all the time to everyone, trying to people please, trying to be a perfectionist, like all the things. I say that autoimmune disease has 3 Ps: perfectionism, people pleasing, and the poison of past pain. And sure enough, I realized I had never had this like anger about that experience, which had to be a first step before I could digest it. First, I had to even recognize that it needed to be there. So we do a lot of what is frequently called spiritual bypass, when we're in the law of attraction, manifesting kind of transformational leadership world, where people are actually given permission to feel their emotions first so they can digest them. And within 6 months, my rheumatoid arthritis was gone because I actually went in and started like recognizing how this enteric nervous system, how my central nervous system, like what had happened and the kinds of patterns that I had created. And I started investigating autoimmune disease and saying, oh my gosh, we have over 100 autoimmune diseases and 50 million Americans suffer from them. There must be something here that we're not doing very well, right? And then in particular, women were diagnosed with 80% of all autoimmune diseases. And I thought, so what is it about women? And so as I went into that, I started realizing like, oh, this microbiome is a piece of the puzzle. And then the way that we process our emotions and digest them is another piece. And this all goes back to this very early, genetics, our toxic load, our digestive health, and our early childhood experiences and the meanings that we made about them. So I call these the 4 corners of solving the autoimmune puzzle, is because each one of them actually is important to tackle at the same time. So that microbiome being one of the 4, because it influences all the rest. and all the rest influence it.
And,
Not
and
linear.
one thing I want to point to here is your environmental toxins. And I think obviously because our world is so contaminated with chemicals and metals and these toxins, we think immediately that of that type of toxin. And now we're starting to introduce electromagnetic fields, so people are aware of that. But I think the more pervasive toxins that we are faced with are these beliefs, these thought patterns, and the meanings, right? As you highlight there, I just want to sort of bring awareness to that because, there's so much of, especially when we're children, what we're being influenced by our teachers and our coaches. And it all comes from a place of love and compassion. Usually it's sort of distorted and they don't know how to express it. And they don't, I think a lot of times we don't understand what we're really conveying to somebody, but I remember in sports, in pre-high school, high school, and in college, I was taught to suppress my emotions because on the sports field, it's really important to maintain neutrality. You don't want to go off and get all in your head and get crazy with emotion because that detracts from what you're really trying to do from an objective perspective on the field, so to speak. So I thought, wow, I was taught from a very early age to not show emotion, not feel emotion. And it first starts with not showing it, but then you learn, okay, well, I can't even feel it because it's not even good to feel it. So you learn to suppress, like you said, the undigested anger. Those types of things start to become suppressed and build up inside you. So, and then there's these thoughts and beliefs that come with it. And it's like, it's crazy how much that's available to us in our world.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And then there's the feminine side of that of, you use the word crazy, of women when they're young being told to stop expressing their emotions because they're too sensitive, right? And so it comes into that realm too of girls being called too sensitive or too much, and growing up thinking that if they cry or they scream or carry on, that they're actually going to be called crazy. Right. And so part of what I do in my deep immersion trauma healing retreats is I actually have them lean into their crazy, like, okay, let's find that crazy woman. Where is she? Bring her out. Where's the crazy bitch? We all have her, men and women. And, let's give her, like, pull her out from behind the energy wall that you hold up to make sure that you never meet her and that no one ever sees her. And when you can pull that energy down and bring her out, and she gets to actually integrate with you, then she doesn't have to speak in that kind of a tone and that voice and that too much excess. Right. Because now whatever it was that she was representing for you can be integrated into your whole self. And then you can use a different way of expressing those emotions because now you've been given permission,
Right. And same thing for men. I see this a lot in men's groups. We're taught, of course, not to cry, not to really feel things, so suppress emotion. And I actually remember when you said that, it triggered my memories. It's become very present in my world these days of how often I was told that I'm too sensitive when I was a child. You're too sensitive. Stop being so sensitive. And boy, it's like that's the perfect recipe. That plus the sports, it was like that trains me real quick not to feel emotion, not to show emotion. And so all these things get suppressed. And the beliefs that come from that is that it's not safe to feel emotion because I'm being told by my caregivers, my loved ones, that I shouldn't be that way. I'm not okay if I have this emotion. If I am a sensitive person, I'm not okay. And so you create beliefs and meanings out of this that I'm not safe if I do this, right?
Right. You'll get rejected from the tribe. And if you're rejected from the tribe, the saber-toothed tiger can eat you. And so we try and conform then and lock ourselves into this structure that is acceptable, that we think is acceptable by general society. And as we evolve in our own movement and consciousness, we start to learn that, that's not true. Right.
And then our nervous system now is now skewed, right? And cortisol is being produced, and now the gut health. So here you go, right?
Here it is again, right? So all this happens as a result of that, which of course we don't want to alter our genetic expression. We don't want, well, this is not what we want, right? So I just got this email yesterday when I was updating these slides for this event, and it was it was just really interesting because it kind of spoke to this. She says, "Hello, Dr. Keesha, thank you for your email. I joined your site because I heard you." This was a welcome to the tribe email that she'd gotten. Heard you speaking on a summit about PTSD, and I went back to my own abuse in my childhood. I'm 55. I'm a musician, a classical violin, and then this part is the part that just speaks the poignant part of it, right? I thought maybe the way that I reacted in this world was just a musician's temperament, and I'm tired of reacting like that. So in other words, she's gotten feedback throughout her life. At the age of 55, she's now willing, and this is a really big, important word, to confront that idea that maybe the way that I react to stress I can get involved with it and I can shift it. I can actually talk to my nervous system. I can go back and I can do some healing so that it's not behaving in that way anymore.
Wow.
Right?
That's huge. I just want to sort of highlight this and sort of give you credit here, Keesha, because this is amazing that you didn't have to tell her. Nobody told her that she should be this way or she should do this. She came to this realization on her own. And when we can do that on our own and be honest with ourselves and say, you know what, I think I can shift this. Maybe this was a little off. Maybe I can recognize it. That's so powerful. That is such a huge thing when it comes to healing.
It's the only way that you actually get somewhere, you know, because we're like Charlie Brown teachers in the background, right? Remember that? Wah, 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 wah. until finally inside the observer's mind witnesses enough of a pattern that says, you know what? I've been destroying my own relationships. Wherever I go, there I am. I think something needs to shift about me. And when you can get there, I call this the misery to motivation ratio in my book. And I say, this is human nature. The more miserable we get, the more motivated we are to make that shift that needs to happen and to go do that healing work. And this contributes to the critical mass. So just so we were talking about earlier, and I was saying it's not just one thing, right? It's not 3 bugs in a microbiome of 100 trillion organisms that's actually the cause of the problem, right? 3 bugs are a reflection of what's going on. And so now let's take a look at this critical mass. What am I eating? What am I thinking? What's my digestive health like? Have I really dealt with the way that I created my perceptions in childhood and how they're running the show today? And I can go back and I can start taking some things off my barge and starting to take it so that it's not lisping to the left, right? So I've been talking about this hurt model, which came from the hurt study I conducted in 2013. And what this does, it actually explains why the ACEs study came up with the statistical probabilities that it did. Higher your ACE score, the higher your risk for disease and self-neglect. And then that's going to be the higher your risk for low microbiome diversity, a narrower resilience in emotional function because you have less volume in your prefrontal cortex, and then also a hyperreactive immune response or immune and nervous system response because your amygdala volume is higher and you're always in like meerkat mode, right? So the way that I was able to map this back in 2013 was, okay, so when you're young, remember you don't have a fully developed brain yet. And the other piece around this, we don't have 24/7 a fully attuned, well-adjusted, grounded caregiver guiding us through our lives at all times to help us navigate experiences that we can't explain for ourselves. So we're meaning-making people. So we're going to make up meanings that fit with our developmental state and stage and our brain development. So first, long ago, right, in your past, you had experiences as a child from the time you entered this world that you couldn't explain. And sometimes you would have a well-adjusted, hopefully attuned caregiver at your side to help you understand it. And then other times you won't. So when you have something that happens that you can't explain, maybe, and I use examples like, mine's easy to track because it's sexual abuse. You can like instantly see that. And then I have a really interesting birth story too that's easy to track, right? But then I've done therapy on people where their big trauma has been, I remember a woman who was the third of three girls, and she never got new clothes. She always got hand-me-downs. And so to her, that was a huge traumatic thing. Every time she got a hand-me-down, it just meant to her that she wasn't worthwhile. And then another guy that had hyperhidrosis that worked in a big famous company here in Seattle had to get up and give presentations a lot, and he would just pit out his shirts. He came to see me because he'd been to doctor after doctor after doctor, taken beta blockers, gotten Botox in his armpits, the whole 9 yards, and nothing was helping. And he came in, and I started asking him about the first time that he ever felt like it was unsafe to be in front of a group of people. And he went instantly back to this cafeteria moment in middle school where he had tripped and dropped his tray of food and it clattered, you know, that sound in the cafeteria. Everything went flying. And the girl that he had a crush on was sitting at the cool girls table right there in front, you know, of the whole thing. And they all were laughing. And so for the remainder of his time in school, all the way till high school graduation, he never once ate in a cafeteria again. He went into the library and he studied while he ate. And that, you know, you can see that's an adaptive behavior to that event. But what happened was he made up a meaning, and no one had actually helped him find the meaning that he made up about himself in that moment. And for him, it was, I can't be trusted, I'm a klutz, and I'm going to make a fool out of myself. And so then the behavior that he adopted to match that meaning and that belief was, I need to hide. So then when his boss says, get up in front of a group of people and present on the stuff that you actually know backwards and forwards and you're brilliant about, he can't handle it because it goes back into his nervous system response of fight or flight. You know, in his case, it was flight. And get the hell out, right? So this model shows you, like, it walks you through. So I'm going to take you through mine because it's so easy to track, right? So I'm 10, the intercom goes off in my 5th grade classroom every day for the Pledge of Allegiance. I was a Navy brat. And so every time it went off, I went into, like, you know, fight or flight, right? Triggered like a Pavlovian dog. And every once in a while, it would be to call me into the vice principal's office. So every time the intercom went off, I went into a death race inside of my body. But every once in a while, it was valid. Not that often, actually. So for me, then, that creates, and this is what happens. We have an emotion first. So for me, it was terror. And then it's going to get locked into your body in some place. Sometimes people hold it in their jaw, some in their neck and their chest and their gut. Sometimes it's a full body. And then you're going to do this fight, flight, or freeze. A lot of times children, because children are powerless, right, and not autonomous, they go into freeze. So I would go into straight freeze. And then the meaning that I created out of that was, because I was being told I was a bad kid, was that I must be a bad kid. And so the belief that I held to match that meaning, so you're following that yellow loop, right, is, oh, I have to be perfect to even survive. Not to be loved or respected or part of the tribe, but to just like flat out survive, right? And so the behavior that I adopted was to be a perfectionist. And I was really good at it until I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis at 30. I was such a good perfectionist. And it's not sustainable, because every time someone would come along and push that button of I'm not good enough, or I have to do better, or gosh, it didn't even have to be someone else. I ran marathons and I could look at my own watch and I could say, gosh, you know, I didn't really do a very good personal record on that race. I could have done better, right? So always competing with myself to be better, 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 better. Now, the next part of this model, it bifurcates, and you have an opportunity to make a shift based on a challenge that life hands you, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And so for me, it was rheumatoid arthritis. Life had handed me plenty of other things and I hadn't listened, but that one actually got me to sit down because I couldn't move anymore. And in that space, then you get an opportunity to either self-confront or keep on doing what you've always been doing. Now, if you go into that maladaptive memory processing loop on the left, which I'd been doing for, since I was 10, 20 years, then you're actually going to create disease, okay? Because you're not self-confronting, you're taking the beliefs and meanings that you chose in childhood to match experiences that it made sense at the time. Like if you witness that 10-year-old making up that meaning at that time, it makes total sense. But they're not sustainable in adulthood. And that's why after you're 26, you get an opportunity to go back and redo those. Now, guess what happened? My microbiota changed too, as I went over and started doing the work on the green circle. So I started self-confronting, saying, So digesting my anger by doing trauma healing work, doing the 5 R's of gut healing, all of the functional medicine pieces and the trauma work. And my autoimmune disease was gone in 6 months, and my microbiome had shifted dramatically, as well as my mood and my memory. I had such bad mood swings. So this is why the ACEs study came up with what it did and how you can kind of track yourself inside of it.
That's beautiful. And I just want to highlight this idea that we all have many of these things that we're caught in these loops all over the place. Some of them are very adaptive, and some of them are maladaptive, and maybe even some are kind of in this in between where they're sometimes this way and sometimes that way, in various degrees of adaptation. And I think the important thing here is not to say you've got to heal the 48 things you've got going on here that are in the maladaptive category, but rather there's an opportunity to really find these big ones that are really disturbing or influencing the system. And for many people really that are stuck, that can be such a powerful tool to get things moving again and start to find progress, even if it's not complete resolution of what they're dealing with. It's like, man, what I find is we don't really need full healing to feel good about what we're doing. All we need is progress. And if I'm just moving in the right direction, and this is the case with just about everything, it's just the direction. And it feels so good to be moving in direction. I don't need to be a billionaire to feel good about my finances, but if I'm moving in the right direction with my finances, God, I feel so great, right? So it's just this progress, I think.
Well, the other interesting thing about that is you can take like the part of you that started creating these meanings in the first place when you were a kid is ego development. Ego always gets a really bad rap, right? But the ego is what actually protects you. And so you bring it on to protect your fragile little psyche when you're innocent and young. So that part of like that perfectionism, nobody wants a medical provider that is less than perfect. And so I can turn perfectionism on when I need it, but it doesn't drive my sense of worth. And then I can relax it, like when I'm parenting or I'm being someone's spouse, right? Nobody wants to be married to a perfectionist, and no one wants to be married or parented by a perfectionist. And so, it's learning when to use that strategy that you've learned really well for when it's useful, but then learning how to down regulate it when it's not. And not having it go into a fight, flight, freeze if it's not in place as a thing that is actually around safety, right? So you can use perfectionism, and I did this for a little while, to heal yourself. And it just creates the same looping, right? Like I have to do this diet perfectly. I have to do, so that same intensity can come to it and then go. And luckily I had a meditation practice, and I was learning how to start witnessing myself, and I was going, I'm doing it again. Okay, take a deep breath, right? Because I could feel that like a ramped up nervous system starting again, and the sort of like frenetic, panicked, I'm not going to get better. I'm not going to get better. And if I don't do this perfectly, I'm not going to get better, right? Well, of course, that's still the same thing put into a different behavioral loop. So it's learning how to actually laugh at all of it, and bring some lightness to it and say, and go back to that little 10-year-old kid in my case and say, oh, sweetie, you're totally safe. No one's going to do that again. And that this is not that, right? I've got you.
And you did such a good job. right? Like you
Yes,
did
and you
such an
did
amazing job.
such a good job. My gosh, what you did in that time was perfect, and just reinforce it.
Yeah,
And then, and you don't need, now you can play and I've got this now, right?
right,
And
right.
so it's just learning how to bring, and in fact, there's a program that I have written and recorded that we'll offer to people at the end. It's called You Unbroken, and it's teaching you how to do this very thing, because what you're doing is you're creating more emotional resilience. You're learning, and emotional resilience is actually a key word for microbiome resilience, right?
Mm,
For genetic resilience, for physical resilience. And so you're learning how to actually bring some space into there where it's not so catastrophic all the time,
yeah,
right?
beautiful.
Yeah. So the ABCs of microbial health, I'm going to say we're going to walk through like how to actually influence this in a positive way. First, really know your adverse childhood experiences. A is know that stuff. What are those adverse childhood experiences? Not so you can blame everything that's happening on that or on your mother or on your father or whoever it is, but so that you can bring some awareness that you can touch lightly and say, oh, what are the meanings I created around that? Okay, because we know that the higher your score, the higher the risk for any of those diseases that we're talking about that are influenced by the microbiome. So tracking your beliefs from those adverse childhood experiences, I think, is where people really don't get to, and it's why they get lost in the weeds. So they'll go to like, yes, I had this. You saw the letter that came from the violinist, right? She said, I knew I had this abuse. And then I also have this temperamental piece. And now I'm starting to realize that, oh, this isn't okay. I don't want this anymore. So now she's starting to track her beliefs. So what did I decide was an okay way of behaving that's not serving me any longer? How's it getting in my way? So, because we know that this unresolved trauma and those beliefs, it's the perception that actually triggers your neurotransmitters to send out cortisol from your adrenals that breaks down your gut wall, that then creates the problem, right? And changes the composition of your microbiome. It's those beliefs. So we also know that hurt causes genetic dysregulation. And we really want, like, studies have shown that 7 generations into your future can be impacted by one shift in your genetic. And that's not supposed to be scary. It's supposed to just be information that you can go, oh, wow, right? And we know this from studies that have been done on Holocaust survivors. So there, and also war veterans are.
Well, and Keisha, I want to point out that to me, what I hear is how empowered that makes me.
Yeah.
Like, in other words, if I can shift something in the good direction, that has consequences,
Too,
7
right?
generations or more, right? So it's like, wow,
Yeah.
what can I do now? And for a lot of us, and I would put myself into this category, is starting to maybe continuing to find a better balance between serving others and serving myself. But the dominating part for me has been service to others. And so that part kicks on and I'm like, ooh, what can I can do a lot of good for other people if I just do
Right.
this good thing. So, which is to say, I'm working on viewing that for myself too. And it's great to view that sort of altruistic standpoint where I can benefit so many people by making good decisions for myself.
It's so true. And, and again, tracking my own story, my grandfather had rheumatoid arthritis, right? And so that's a genetic expression that I upregulated, and happened through a critical mass of a variety of factors, including past trauma, but other things also. And I was able to reverse that, stop the genetic expression of the RA gene that I carry, and none of my kids thus far have any autoimmune diseases, right? And so this is power. This is
Absolutely.
autonomy inside of your own body, as long as you can be in this beautiful co-regulatory relationship with it. So again, remembering that prefrontal cortex shrinkage, right? We have that optimal, lots of volume, and the stressed one that's lower, just kind of keeping that in mind of, oh, do I consider myself overwhelmed and stressed? If I do, I'm causing this kind of brain change. So I can change that in the very next breath. I don't have to have a special gadget, an app on my phone. In just one breath with your inspiration and your inhalation, you can breathe down into your belly and you can actually stimulate your vagus nerve.
I'm glad to see that we're starting to recognize the power of breath. They've been talking about it forever in the Eastern sciences, and we're starting to recognize this, but it is so powerful, and it is the medicine that I think so many of us need to combat this hyper doing and hyper thinking in our Western world. So I'm glad that you're able to bring this to us, because it's the most powerful tool that I've recognized that I can consciously shift so easily.
And you don't have to, you know how like there's the on Monday I'm going to start my diet kind of attitude, right? You can do this in your next breath. Right? My next breath is into my belly.
Right.
You know, so do that. Like put your hands over your belly, and as you inhale, make it pregnant with your breath. So it literally goes out pregnant under your hand. And then as you exhale and it goes concave back towards your spine as you really wring out your toxins. Your lungs are one of your organs of detoxification. So it's just that simple.
And this is influencing our whole nervous system, right?
That's the nervous system, yeah. Which is actually influencing your microbiome and your genetic expression. It's that simple.
Right.
We do not have to make this hard, right? So C is connect the dots, and that's going to be between the food you eat and what your microbiome is, between the thoughts that you're thinking and what your microbiome is and your genetic expression. You know, like just making what's your sleep quality, what's your libido level, what's your weight, what are like look at all of the things that are data points for you to be able to measure how you and your body are doing, and then connect the dots between your lifestyle choices and what that data is showing you. People like to remain disconnected from that.
Well, I think we've got a few obvious cases that are sort of highlighted in the movies and these type of things. But when we have a breakup or an emotionally difficult situation, we turn to ice cream or chocolate, right? And this is a sort of common thing that we point out. But this is just a perfect example of how your behavior, how your emotions, and how your physical body is all sort of responding in this milieu that you can take a step back from and just at least at first observe. Even if you still make the choice, you can start to see the connections and connect the dots like you're mentioning.
And you can do it with compassion. If you're going to sit on the couch and eat a pint of Ben & Jerry's after a breakup, do it with curious compassion into yourself and love yourself.
And enjoy it while you're
shamefully.
at it.
Yeah, don't shame yourself for it, right?
Right.
So now we're into the 1, 2, 3. People always ask me, so Dr. Keesha, what is your autoimmune, protocol? And I always say there isn't one. You know, we're all different. There's no such thing as an autoimmune paleo diet that is right for every single person. There's no AIP, that's right for every person. So the first thing is to start with food. That's the obvious, because that's several times a day you're feeding your microbiome, right? And I always say that there's not one right diet for everybody. It's why I do genetic testing. It's why I do food sensitivity testing, just to see like, what is your immune system up and out about right now? Like, why is it like a rabid dog trying to bite everybody? What do we need to do to retrain it so it's a nice dog and it says, hey, happy you're here, right? And then I always test because I want to know, like, what are the data points that your body is giving us right now? And then the third thing is heal your hurt. That's huge. And I have up here the stress busting toolkit, which is autogenic training and progressive relaxation. It's getting you in touch with your nervous system, like I was saying, so that it's not acting like a child going through a grocery store, knocking all the cans down. And it has a little biofeedback thermometer on it with it that you tie around your finger. And when you can drive your temperature up in your fingertips by 5 degrees, you've mastered getting into your nervous system and helping it regulate. You're co-regulating. And so this You Unbroken program that we've been talking about actually includes that with it.
Amazing. That's this You Unbroken program. I as somebody who knows you personally and familiar with your work, I haven't seen this. Is this fairly new, something you've developed recently, or have you been working with this for a while?
Long time. Yeah.
Beautiful. And so give me a little bit more about it, the 3 modules. What kind of things are included?
So it goes through and it takes you through first the why, the wherefore, why it goes to the hurt model and the hurt study and some of the stuff that I talked about here. And then it goes through and it helps you identify 10 forms of emotional resilience. And you get to ascertain whether or not you need some help in one or more of those.
Mm.
And then in the third module, it gives you worksheets and the stress busting toolkit and tools for actually gaining skill in that particular portion of emotional resilience. So emotional resilience, you know, you can have emotional resilience with your finances, in your social circles, with your intimate relationships, with yourself, you know, so it's all of those places in your life that you want to be resilient in, but it helps you to actually assess whether or not you are resilient in those areas, and then it gives you tools for gaining it. One of the things that's so fascinating to me is that people know that you have to practice the piano to become skillful at it, and you have to start with this like clunky chords, right? But when it comes to mind training, we don't even have really a word for that, and a value system built around mind training. And this is mind training. It's helping you to be able to train your mind so it doesn't react in ways that actually harm you, not other people, you. Harm your microbiome, harm, you know, you and the way that you express your genetics. And also just your mood, your happiness, and your ability to be in the world in a way that makes it feel like the world has your back, right? This
Yeah.
is all resilience. And resilience, of course, is the darling word in the aging sciences right now. And it's an important one, you know, it just means that you're flexible. So it helps you develop that skill, which means you have to practice it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much for this amazing presentation, and we'll link to this You Unbroken program directly on this screen. I think this is one of the things that I am continuously faced with when talking about emotional traumas and these developmental wounds and belief systems, and this idea people don't know where to go. You know, the
Right.
concept can land, I think, for a lot of people, but man, it's like, what do we do next? And there's amazing healers out there that work directly with this stuff. But for so many of us, we may not have great ones in the area. And we just don't know where to turn when it comes to digging a little deeper, because the concept lands, but it's like, how do I investigate this stuff? And I think even for me, that's still constantly what I'm asking. How do I dig deeper? Where are the things that I'm missing? What are the shadow elements that I need to shed some light on? And so I think it's so important to have these types of programs that come from somebody that understands how to work with these, and is, in my experience, has worked with it themselves enough to understand how to put this together for somebody else.
Well, the thing that I actually did this for was because people will say, like in my hurt model, it says, go do trauma healing therapy, right? So then they'll go find a therapist, and they don't know where to start. Like, they don't even know what to say, what to do, So in self-assessing, like, here I am in my own level of resilience in this section of my life, I realize I need to gain some more skill in this. You can actually go to a therapist and say, here's where I need to start.
Right.
And I've realized that here's where it's connected to. And then you actually get some traction when you're trauma healing therapy, because talk therapy does not work.
Right.
And so, you know, it can take 20 years to get you anywhere with talk therapy. Talk therapy you can do with your friends. So one of the things that's part of this program is I'll say, okay, so if you can't do this part, there's like a hard stop, and it says, now you need to go borrow a brain. And that's what I call therapy. It's borrowing a brain, someone that's trained to understand patterns and how to interrupt them. And so in my book, Solving the Autoimmune Puzzle, I have my favorite graphic of all time that I've done is a dog chasing its tail around and around. We've all seen that, right? And then next to it is a brain chasing its spinal column around and around. And I always say, this is your mind chasing its TALE, its tail, its story. And so the very mind that created that story can't solve it by itself, because it chases it around and around and around. So you actually need someone to come out here and be able to witness the pattern that's been created and help you recognize it so you can interrupt it. And so that's the value of really good therapy and trauma healing therapy. And so I also give people, like, here's how to find the right person. And it's very much like finding who you want to marry. Like, just because that person has training doesn't mean it's the right one for you. And I also go through how to discover that. Like, for example, if you've been seeing someone for 10 years and they're your buddy, that is not a therapist for you any longer.
Right.
You need someone that will hold your feet to the fire, like
push those edges, right?
Push those edges. That's not your buddy, you know?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of that in there, like how to find the right therapist to help you through this next level of your development.
Well, and I think, the mirror analogy is a good one too, right? If we don't have a mirror, we can feel our face and we can try to get an idea. We can have people talk to us about what we look like, but until we have that mirror and that those good therapists act as a really brilliant mirror for us, then we can start to see, oh, that's what's going on there, right? So and these are hard things sometimes to uncover about ourselves. And it was sort of that way for a reason, right? I mean, these are survival tactics, and then they become so ingrained into who we think we are, to these ego structures and these personality strategies, that we become blind to them until we start to consciously look at them. And even then, as you said, we have to
we identify them and they become part of our identity, right? I am this. And so and that's where it becomes a problem.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, this is so huge. This is why I wanted to have you on, is because all of these emotional wounds and these stories and these things that we create are influencing, from a simplistic standpoint, they're influencing the nervous system. And just looking at the digestive aspect, right? Nervous system is controlling hydrochloric acid production, enzyme production, right? Is the migrating motor complex that's pushing food through the digestive tract, our liver function, our bile function, kidney function, excretory. Everything is controlled by this nervous system. And we often say rest and digest, right? So we need to get our nervous system shifted into that state to allow all these things to happen. If they don't, then, all this downstream effects, and we talked about it a lot in this summit, when we don't produce enough hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes, we're not breaking down our food properly, that's going to create shifts in the microbiota, leaky gut, on and on and on and on. So it comes down to that. And there's a lot of great solutions in the gut health space, from supplements and enzyme formulations and probiotics and prebiotics and dietary choices and exercise and lifestyle patterns. And all those are fantastic, and I think they should be used. And also, if we have these programs running in the background that's shifting our nervous system, all this good stuff that we're doing over here might help us move forward. And also, it may just keep us going around in a circle, because we're not really shifting the nervous system to a state that allows us to heal and recover, despite the fact that our gut cells turn over every couple of days. We just can't get any traction because we're stuck in a program, right?
Right. And that's what I tell my patients. You don't want expensive urine,
Right.
Like change this, and it actually affects all of how many pills you have to take. So
absolutely. Well, and I know you got into this work because your path led you there and got you unstuck. And I see this all the time with the people that I work with, and
I'm
just
still
friends
unsticky.
And family. Yes.
Let us not let us not even believe that I am unstuck.
Yes, I'm right there.
Maybe you're unstuck, Jason, but gosh. I am not.
As soon as I think I'm unstuck, that's a pretty good signal that I'm still very, very much stuck.
Life comes up with the whack-a-mole.
Yes, but these are the aspects, I think, that for so many of us, when we start to get a grasp on them and start to move them, we start to see so much traction in the way we feel and the way our body responds. And so again, that's why I think it's so important that you join us for this, because it's, for a lot of people, it may be the thing that is keeping them from moving forward to the places they really want to go with their health and their mood and their mindset and their spiritual practice and whatever else it might be.
Well, I get patients that come in that say, I've for years been almost there, and this last 15%, I can't break through. And then I heard you talk about this and I went, oh, that's me, And it is so true. Like it's until that part's addressed. So.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And again, we'll be linking to your program. I think it's very important if you think you might have some of these things to work through and to discover about yourself and to integrate and to digest from an emotional standpoint, please check out Keesha's program. She does amazing work. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, Keesha. And
thank you.
For everybody else, we'll see you on the next one.